All right. So I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive in. All right, so Ajax and JSON. First, we'll talk about JSON. JSON is a format for communication between different sources on the web. So those sources could be your web page asking an API like Google Maps to give you a Google Map some kind of information back. But when you get into building your own servers, that's also how you'll communicate between your front end, so what the user sees on the browser, what actually runs in Chrome, and a server that you may have constructed, so the back end that you're building. Those will also usually communicate in JSON or some variant of JSON. There's some other JSON type formats. So what does it stand for? It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. I do want to say I've broken up JavaScript onto 2 lines. In case anyone doesn't know, Java and JavaScript are 2 completely different things. JavaScript sounds like Java only by historical accident. When the company Netscape invented JavaScript, Java was a very hot language at the time, so they thought they would just call it JavaScript as a way of like kind of advertising to developers to get them into it, but the 2 languages actually are very different. All right, so that was a minor tangent. In any case, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And as you can guess from that name, it looks a lot like a JavaScript object. In JSON, all of the keys and values are stringified. You'll notice that everything is between quotation marks. But it is structured like a JavaScript object. And similarly to objects, you can have nested objects inside of this. Fortunately for us, we don't have to spend time formatting our data as JSON. JavaScript gives us 2 methods for this, JSON.stringify and JSON.parse. And I do want to note that in order to access these methods, you're referencing a JSON object. This is a native JavaScript object in the way that the date or the math object is, but it's important to note that it is all in caps. That's actually how you have to write it out to access those methods. So JSON.stringify converts JavaScript values and data structures into properly formatted JSON. So you'll call JSON.stringify and you'll pass in whatever JavaScript values you want to stringify into JSON, and it will stringify them for you. And I would recommend trying to pass in different kinds of values, like pass in an array that has maybe an object inside of it and also a string inside of it and also, an undefined space and some numbers, just to see how this method works with different types of data types. And it will give you a more clear understanding of how things are supposed to be formatted for JSON. Again, you're usually not like hand coding out JSON. You're using one of these methods to stringify it, but it is good to know in what ways it stringifies different value types and how it handles edge cases. JSON.parse works in reverse. It parses JSON and converts it into JavaScript values. So a lot of the times, if you ask somewhere else online for data, it's going to give you an answer in JSON. And the way that then you'll be able to work with that data is to parse it so that it becomes a JavaScript object. And once it's an object, you can start accessing different properties on that object. You'll see today that we're going to work with something called the Open Weather API. It's going to give you back JSON, and you're going to have to parse it so that you can, for instance, if you get this big JSON formatted object of weather data, you might just want the current temperature. So you'll parse it and then say something like data.current temperature. All right, so before we move on to Ajax, are there questions about JSON? All right. Let's see, before I do move on, I don't see, there's usually like a yellow box around my screen when I'm screen sharing. Okay, it is there. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't back sharing my screen. All right, so Ajax is a means of interacting with servers behind the scenes using JavaScript without having to reload the page. It allows you, this is one of the things that allows us to create complex web apps that behave like desktop apps. So something like Gmail, where you can be interacting on the page and it doesn't have to reload the page. It used to be the case that any user interaction, you would click, it would go ask the server, and the server would give it back an entire web page, and it would have to reload the whole page. And one of the reasons why the modern internet can run more quickly is because it can be using Ajax to communicate asynchronously and change certain parts of the page without changing everything. Now, Ajax is not the only reason for that. We also have different ways of creating pages. We have JavaScript frameworks now that allow us to change certain parts of the page without re-rendering, but this is a piece of it. All right, so the A in Ajax stands for asynchronous. When we ask a server for information, what's going to happen is that we'll ask it for information, and then the rest of our script will continue to run without waiting for that answer. And then later on, that answer is going to come back. And you'll see that we have to code in certain patterns to be able to account for that asynchronous nature. I thought that there were more slides for the rest of it. I'll go ahead and briefly talk about the other letters. Altogether, Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And XML is another language that is used in browsers. It's not as popular as it was when Ajax and that acronym was first created, but that's what Ajax stands for. And for our cases, we're just going to be working with asynchronous JavaScript. Yeah. Is that Christian? Is that asynchronous JavaScript and JavaScript, or asynchronous JavaScript and jQuery, or something else that I haven't thought of? jQuery. Cool. Yeah, so that's what we're about to dive into. jQuery gives us several methods for making Ajax requests. So we can ask for and send information to servers. jQuery's Ajax method. So this is the first method we're going to look at, jQuery.ajax. And it takes two arguments, a URL as a string. So you'll take the URL that you're going to ask information from, and you'll stringify it. And then the second part is an options object. So you'll construct an object, and there'll be a bunch of different default keys on it that you can decide to give, set certain values at. You can set certain values on these default keys, but there's a whole lot of default keys that come with it, and you can skip a lot of them. You don't have to completely fill out the options object. All right, so yeah, there's many options that you can provide the options object. You can actually attach the URL onto the options object. You can give it a method, a success function, an error function, headers, data that you want to pass along, the data type. So we'll be putting JSON today, a status code, and many more. And I'll talk about what the status code is in a minute when I'll actually make an Ajax call. All right, so I'm going to make an Ajax call, and I'm just putting the URL in my options object. So this is my URL, and then the method I'm using is get. You have to give it a method. These are HTTP methods. The four most common are get, post, put, and delete. Today we'll only be using get. I'll talk a little bit more about where these come from in a minute, but I'm not going to get too in depth on what they all do. just because we won't need them today, and you probably won't need them in your project unless you're working with some kind of database as a service like Firebase. And if you do get to that point, then I can come help you. I can give you specific help on that. All right, so success function. This is a function that is going to be called when when data is successfully returned to us. So this function will take one argument. That argument is going to be the data. You don't have to call it data. You can name this parameter whatever you want. But the important thing is that the argument that gets passed to it is going to be the data. And usually you're going to want to do some stuff with the data once it comes back. In this case, I'm just console logging it. You'll also probably want to construct some error handling so that if an error is returned, you log it out and you can figure out what's going on. I will note, I don't think it would happen in this case, but oftentimes if there's an error in your code and you don't handle it in some way, it can halt the execution of the script or just break parts of the code. All right, so what is REST? REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Similar to Ajax, it's a specific protocol for sending and receiving data across the internet. It's not super important to understand what REST is in depth right now. What you do need to know is that the HTTP methods that I mentioned a minute ago, that's where they come from. And the four most common ones are get, post, put, and delete. And I'll just briefly say get is where you ask for a specific piece of data. Post is where you create a new entry. Put is where you, actually, I'm trying to remember if I'm getting these reversed. I think post is where you can update a piece of data. Put is just putting a new piece of data. And then delete is deleting an entry. And on top of those four, there are some other less common ones. Again, today we'll only be using get because we are working with an API that we don't have the access to add data to it. You know, if we try to post something to the open weather data, like we can't change what the weather forecast is somewhere or change weather data that they're getting from somewhere else. So they're only going to let us get data from them. What are APIs? So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And we've already worked with some kinds of APIs. This doesn't always refer to making Ajax requests. An API is the part of a system that is exposed to a user. So for instance, with jQuery, the API for jQuery are the methods that we have access to. There's some other internal machinery in the jQuery library, but we only have access to certain methods, and that's the interface that we can interact with. In regards to Ajax, APIs are the places and types of data that the owner of a server has given us access to. So going back again to the Open Weather API, we only have access to get the data from specific URLs. We can't post data to that API. Today we'll be using a free API called the Open Weather API. And the Open Weather API has several what are called endpoints, API endpoints, which are specific URLs that allow us to access specific types of data. So let's take this one, for instance, up here. We can use this URL to make a GET request to the Open Weather API. Notice the question mark in the URL right after weather. That's the beginning of what's called a query. So what we're saying is we want the weather for Chicago. This is going to give us the current weather forecast for Chicago. But we could change where it says Chicago after the equal sign, we could change that to San Francisco. We could change that to, Chattanooga, Tennessee. We could change it to Chattanooga. We're essentially saying this is the type of information that I'm asking for, and then this is the specific data point that I want. So different APIs will want you to structure your requests in different ways. And as part of the assignment today, you'll be asked to read through OpenWeather API's documentation a little bit. You always want to read through the documentation when you first start to work with an API to figure out, A, what they want from you in order to get data back. Like the OpenWeather API, you have to provide it an app ID. Now we've provided an app ID as part of the curriculum today, so you won't have to worry about that. But for instance, if you wanted to go build your own application using the OpenWeather API, you'd have to go to their website, you'd have to register an account, and then they would automatically generate you an app ID that you would use when you make GET requests to them. Additionally, the documentation is going to tell you about what the information looks like when it's coming back from the server. So I've got a little page that I built, just an HTML page. I've included jQuery, so I have those methods. I'm going to get rid of this. So I've just got a header tag. I've got a div with the ID of data. And then I've got a script tag that's pointing to the script Ajax.js. And in Ajax.js, I've made an Ajax request to the OpenWeather API. I say jQuery.ajax. I give it the method of get. I give it the URL. This particular URL is right at the top of the lesson in the curriculum app. So that's where you can find this. And then I've asked for the weather from San Francisco. I've given it the data type of JSON. I've included the app ID as part of my data object. Now it's possible I believe it's possible based on how their API is set up for me to put, how would I format this? On the end of this, I think I could say app ID, and I could put my app ID up here. We'll come back and try that in a second. So you can include this as part of your URL. You don't necessarily have to put it on the data tag. And I think the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to console log out the data that comes back. Oh, I'll save it. Oh no, 1 second. I want to open this page in Chrome because Chrome has better developer tools. All right, so I asked the OpenWeather API for some information, and this is how it came back to me. We have this big object, and oops, let's see, did I parse this when it came back? I don't think I did parse it, which means that it's actually, I think that this may have come back as an object rather than as JSON. So we have, a clouds key, we have coordinates, we have the main object, which is I believe the current weather. So it's got like the maximum temperature today, the minimum temperature today. I do want to note that the default temperature coming back from them is going to be in Kelvin. there's a way to structure your request so that they'll give it back to you in Fahrenheit or Celsius. I'll leave that up to you to figure out. It's in their documentation. And then there's different weather data points. If you can ask for like a 5-day forecast, then you would get multiple data points in here. Right now, since I'm just asking for the current weather, it just gives me 1 point, which is the current weather. Now, I'm going to append them to the page. So I'm going to take that object and I'm going to use a for loop to loop through it. And I'm just going to append each point in that object to the page. You'll notice that I am stringifying it because, for instance, if I tried to append a raw JavaScript object to the page, it would just show up as, well, actually, you know what? I'll show you what it shows up as. Yeah, like some of these things just show up as object in brackets because it doesn't, the HTML doesn't know how to parse that, which is why if you're going to append JavaScript to your page, you got to remember to stringify it. Cool. So now I appended all that stuff to the page. It's not very pretty at the moment because I haven't done anything with it, but you can rearrange it and format it so that it looks more appealing to the user. So that's all I have for the moment. Are there questions about how this works? All right, cool. There are no questions at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and have you do the usual. We'll break off, get into pairs, and go ahead and start working through the lesson. Oh, I promised that I would talk about status codes. Let's reload this page. Cool. So notice if we go to the networks tab in our console, the network tab, we can see requests that we've made. Right now, we've made one GET request, and it returned with a status code of 200. So this is, I believe the status codes are part of the REST protocol and not part of the Ajax protocol. I could be incorrect about that. There are, I think there's up to like 500 and something status code. I don't think that there is a defined use. Most of them are like, for instance, with 200, you'll see like 200, 201, 202. With 400, I think you've got like up to 405. With 300, you know, you don't, I'm trying to think, I think 300 is usually like either you're forbidden to access that point or you need some kind of special credentials to access it. So these status codes are indicating a message back from the server. So 200 means here's the information. It was a successful request. 201 and 202 mean similar things. 400, the numbers, status codes around 400 mean something like we weren't able to find what you were looking for, or you've given us some partially incorrect request. And then again, 300 is usually like, we know what you're looking for, but you're not allowed to access it because you don't have the proper credentials. Like maybe if you don't add your app ID when you ask the Open Weather API for information, they might send us back a 300. Let's try that out. Okay, so I got a 401, which stands for unauthorized. And again, that was because I removed my app ID. So these status codes are just ways that are just messages, kind of a protocol for sending messages back and forth about what happened with a certain request. All right, cool. So without further ado, I will go ahead and let you break off into pairs and get to work on the exercises.